All right, we're going to start graphing sine functions today. So we're going to take 2 days to graph these functions. Today we're going to do just basic functions without a phase shift. And then tomorrow we're going to do a phase shift, and then we'll move on to cosine. In order for you to be successful on this, you must understand how to find the amplitude, period, phase shift, and the midline, because you will find those first before you can graph it. All right, recall I told you we no longer have an x-axis and a y-axis. Instead, just as before, this is the independent axis and dependent axis. Instead, what we have is we have the angle measure right here on this side. And then we have we're graphing a sine function, so this is going to be the length of the leg of a sine function. So if you take a look at the unit circle, I have the radian measures. You can see as we're going around, and I went up to pi, and then I just did 3 pi over 2 and 2 pi. And then I have the sine measure at that. So we know at pi over 6, the sine of pi over 6 is 1/2, and so on. And what we're going to do is we're going to start graphing this. So when we put our angle radian measure down here, we're going to do, I'm going to do 2 pi's, the last one, and I'm going to cut that in half to get to pi, cut that in half again to get to pi over 2, and this would be 3 pi over 2. And of course, there are angle measures that are in between each of these. But what I'm going to do is, rather than graphing all of these functions, these funky ones, okay, we don't want to graph that, we don't want to graph that. Now we could, but what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the simple ones. So we're going to focus on this one, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. So essentially the ones that I put on my independent axis down there. And I'm going to start graphing. So I'm going to do 0 angle measure, or 0 radian measure right there, and 0. So I start right here. And the next one I get is at pi over 2. At pi over 2, I'm at 1. So I'm going to go by half. So I'm going to say this is 1 here, and this is -1 here. So now I'm at 1. And then I'm going to go to the next one I have highlighted, which is pi, and pi is 0. And 3 pi over 2 is -1, and 2 pi is 0. Now, if I graphed all these in between, I'd have to plug this into my calculator and this into my calculator to get the approximations. And then I would have to figure out exactly where they are here. But what's going to happen is I would get something that looks like this. And you can see it's a nice curve. And this is what a sine function looks like without transformations. Now, again, when we're graphing a sine function, what we need to do is we're going to have 5 points. Notice I had 5 points there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 5 points is going to complete a full cycle. And your scale is going to change depending upon your phase shift and your period. So let's take a look at how we're going to graph this. We're going to first start by finding our amplitude, period, phase shift, and the midline. And remember, we have to factor out that b value before we get our phase shift. We're going to determine the 5 key points on the independent axis. And how we're going to do that is we're going to take the period and we're going to divide it by 4, because there's 4 sections in between the 5 points. So we need to know what each one is. We're then going to draw a dotted line to represent the midline of the graph, and we're going to use the amplitude to find the height, the maximum, the minimum of the function. And then we're going to use the pattern of a sine function to determine the graph. And then we'll connect it with a nice smooth curve. So here are the characteristics that you need to know with a sine function. Points 1, 3, and 5 are on the midline. When we created those 5 points there, remember this is our first point, points 1, 3, and 5 were on the midline. When you have a positive function, you will increase first, and then it decreases. So in other words, it's going to go up before it goes down. So points 2 and 4 are the maximum and the minimum. So our maximum originally is 1 and the minimum is -1. So we would come up to 1, go back here. Point 4, which is right here, would be the minimum. And that is what your graph looks like. Now let's talk about domain and range really quick. Domain, all possible x values. This goes forever to the right, forever to the left. The domain is always going to be negative infinity to infinity. And the range is dependent upon your midline and your vertical shift up and down. Currently, my maximum is at +1 and my minimum is -1. So +1 to -1, including both of them, so we use brackets, would be my range currently for a function that has no transformations. Now let's start graphing this. You already know how to find the amplitude, period, phase shift, and midline. The amplitude is the absolute value of this. Midline, this. Period is 2 pi divided by b, and our b value is 1/2, so it's 2 pi divided by 1/2, which is the same as 2 pi times 2/1, so our period is 4 pi. Now, we don't have any phase shift. You won't deal with those today. That would be inside the parentheses attached to the x. What I'm going to have you do is this. You have a period of 4 pi. So you want to complete one full cycle on the interval of 4 pi. So I'm going to make my last tick mark here 4 pi. And now I need to determine what all my other tick marks are. So I'm going to take 4 pi, and I'm going to divide it by 4. Again, the reason I'm dividing it by 4 is because I have 1, 2, 3, 4 sections in between my 5 points. And when I get this, I get pi. Each one of these tick marks is going to represent pi. So I have 1 pi, I have plus another one is 2 pi, 3 pi, and 4 pi. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to determine my midline. So my midline is 1. At 1, I'm going to put a dotted line. That's the center of my graph. My height is my amplitude. I am going to go up to, from the midline, and I'm going to go down to, right here. My function is going to fit in between these two lines here, the two dark lines. I am now going to determine how to graph my sine function. You have to first look to see if it's positive or negative. That's going to affect the graph. And then you see it's a sine function. Well, we already said with sine functions that point 1, 3, and 5, so the first, the middle, and the last are going to be on the midline. We also know because there's no negative here, it's positive, we have to increase before we decrease. We also know point 2, which is this, because remember this is our first point. Point 2 and point 4 are the max of the minimums. Because we have to increase before we decrease, the first point is a maximum, and therefore the second point will be the minimum. And there you go. That is one cycle. You have to graph at least 2 cycles. So I need to put another cycle, and I'm going to do it off to the left. All I have to do is continue to follow the same pattern. These numbers right here are going to be the same because I'm revolving around 0. So I'm just going to add my negatives to them. Same but with opposite signs. I don't think I finished that. And what happens, this is going to have to go down to do this same cycle. So I'm going to go down to my minimum. And then I'm going to go back to my midline, up and down. Or I could follow the same patterns and say, okay, this is point 1, this is 3, this is 5, it's on the midline. And then, of course, usually I increase before I decrease, but I'm going backwards, so it's the opposite, like this. And it has to follow the pattern. Domain and range. Domain, x-axis, left and right. It goes forever to the left, forever to the right. So it's negative infinity to infinity. Range is maximum to minimum. Well, let's see. My lowest point is -1. My highest point is 1, 2, 3. So I'm going from -1 to +3. It includes both of those. Make sure you put your negative number first. All right, I would recommend you try this one. So just go ahead, keep the video playing, just try to work ahead. Find the amplitude, period, phase shift, and midline. Amplitude is 2. Midline is -1. There is no phase shift. Period is 2 pi divided by b, which is 3. Now, I am going to create my scale on the bottom. So my period is 2 pi divided by 3. Now, this is where it gets tricky, because remember, I have to take this value here and I have to divide it by 4 in order to determine what each of these tick marks represent. Well, I can't divide by 4 because I have 2 fractions here. So instead, I'm going to multiply by 1/4. So 2 pi divided by 3 times 1/4. And what I get is 2 pi over 12, or I get pi over 6. Now, when you're creating your scale down here, each tick mark represents pi over 6. So I'm just going to count by pi over 6. I have 1 pi over 6. I have 2 pi over 6. That's the same as pi over 3. That would be better. And then I have 3 pi over 6, which is the same as pi over 2, which would be better. So there is my scale. Now, you guys, you have to have a scale here. So make sure that you have all of those tick marks listed, and if you don't, you're going to lose points. Now, remember, I have to do 2 periods, so I'm just going to go ahead and put my negative values here as well before I forget that. And of course, they're the same values, but with the opposite numbers. And now I can start graphing this. Again, I'm going to begin with the midline. My midline is at -1. That's the center of my graph, and it gets a dotted line. My amplitude is 2. I'm going to go up 2 to get my maximum. You can see my max, my range, is going to be a 1. When I go down 2, I'm at 1, 2, 3. I'm at -3. -3 is my lowest point. That's my range right there, where those 2 lines are. And of course, the domain is -infinity to infinity. So I actually was able to do that before I even got the graph. But now let's graph this. It is a sine graph, and it is positive. So because it's positive, and it's a sine, we know points 1, 3, and 5 are on the midline. 1, 3, and 5 are sitting on the midline. I could go back the other way too right now if I wanted to. I'll go ahead and do that. Now, back to my center point here. Let me change colors so you can see. I'm starting right here. Because it's positive sine, it has to increase before it decreases. Points 2 and 4 are the max and the minimums. So I'm going to hit a maximum first, and this will be the minimum. And when I connect my points, that is 1 cycle. And when I continue on the other side, clearly this has to go down, which means this one goes up. There we go. I now have 2 cycles, and I already found my domain and range. Okay, if you look at this example, it's exactly the same, except for I have a -2 in the front. What you will notice about your amplitude, period, and midline is that everything is the same. Okay, nothing has changed. The amplitude doesn't change either. But here's what the negative does. The negative is just going to reflect it. So this is what our graph looked like before. You don't have to do this again. You can do it on top of your other one. Now, with a new color, I'm going to show you how this changes. What happens is everything that was a maximum before now becomes a minimum because we're reflecting around this midline here. So this point is going to reflect and come down here. This minimum is now going to reflect and become a maximum right here. If you try to reflect something around itself, it doesn't move. So the midline point here, 1, 3, and 5, stay on 1, 3, and 5. So instead of increasing before you decrease, you will decrease before you increase. And this is what your new function will look like. So that's how you deal with a negative. It just reflects your points from being maximums or minimums to maximums. But the ones on the midline remain the same. The domain is the same, the range is the same. You just have to, when you're graphing it, decrease before you increase. So let's practice with this one. So our amplitude is 4. Again, that negative is just a reflection. We'll decrease before we increase. So we'll decrease first. The period, or midline first, 1, no phase shift. The period is 2 pi divided by b. Well, look it. This is written weird. X over 3. What does that mean? It really means it's a 1/3 times an x. 1/3 times x. So our b value is 1/3. So when I go 2 pi and divide it by 1/3, I'm really doing multiplying by the reciprocal. So put 2 pi times 3 over 1, or just 3, which gives me 6 pi. So my period is 6 pi. So my last tick mark here is going to be 6 pi. Now again, to get my 4 tick marks here, I have to do 6 pi and divide it by 4, which is the same as 3 pi divided by 2 when I reduce it. So this is 3 pi over 2. Now I have to add another 3 pi over 2. So what I'm doing is doing 3 pi over 2 plus another 3 pi over 2. And you can plug this in your calculator without using the pi, so 3/2 plus 3/2 if you want to use your calculator. But this is just 1.5 pi plus 1.5 pi. Well, 1.5 and 1.5 is 3. So this is going to be 3 pi. Then I'm going to take that and add another 3 pi over 2. So now I'm going 3 plus 1.5. I'm just looking at the numbers, put the pi on afterwards, and I have 4.5 pi. Well, 4.5 pi is the same as 9 pi over 2. You can write 4.5 pi, that's fine. If I went and added another 1.5 to this, I now have 6, which is where I should be. And if you're struggling with that scale, we can talk about it in class. Make sure you ask, because that is something that people mess up on. Okay, so now that we got that all done, let's start graphing this. So my midline is at 1. There's my midline. My amplitude is 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Here's my maximum, which is at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when I go down 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, my minimum right here is at -3. So that's my range. And I know my domain goes forever. And now points 1, 3, and 5 are always on the midline. That's not going to change. That will be different for a cosine though. Typically I increase before I decrease, but I have a negative, so I have to decrease first. So my next point will be a minimum, and my point 4 will be a maximum. So it's going to look like this. And likewise, I'm going to go up here, down here, down here, and down here. Points 1, 3, and 5 are on the midline, and I just followed the pattern with the rest. And I now have 2 cycles. There is a negative sine graph. All right, only one thing I want to talk about with this, and this is if you look at the A, the B, and the D value, you're going to see that B, the number in front of the X, is pi. So when I find the period, 2 pi divided by B, what I get for a period is 2, meaning this is 2. Okay, there's no radian measure here. Don't worry about that. Okay, this happens every so often. It's not very typical. When I take 2 and divide it by 4, I get 1/2. So this is 1/2. If I add another 1/2, I get 1. If I add another 1/2, I get 3/2, or 1.5. And then adding another 1/2 gives me to 2. And then I could go ahead and continue with this. I'm going to stop right there because I just wanted to talk about this scale. And I know this video is quite long already. Okay, your assignment is to do the 4.5B worksheet, but you're only doing the front side. And also do not submit it into Schoology until we deal with the phase shift, the left and right phase shift, which will be tomorrow. And then you can submit it in Schoology tomorrow. Have a good day.